History does not call her a ruler, it calls her a monster, a sadistic anomaly, stained with the blood of the stones of medieval Normandy, so fierce that even the most cruel knights trembled at the mention of her name. While women of her time were taught to be silent shadows, hiding behind crucifixions and prayers, Mabel de Bellême chose the path of living nightmare, earning the sadly well-known title of a wolf from Alassa, not for her leadership, but for what animal pleasure she received from someone else's pain and agony. How did one countess manage to accumulate so much power and so much pure concentrated hatred, that she was accused of killing the baby with her own lips only to expel her inner demons? Why, after centuries of evidence of her crimes, do they still sound like a gloomy warning about what happens when women's ambitions are armed with absolute, uncontrolled cruelty? In this narrative, we will break the veil of time to expose the true face of evil. Let's go and show how she directed the fall of entire dynasties and, in the end, met fate as violent as the life she forged herself. In the damp and gloomy corridors of the history of the 11th century, where human life was worth less than the rusty sword with which it was taken, Belleme rose above the rest not just by force and weapon, but by real pathological cruelty. In order to truly understand Mabel, the one who the chronicles will later call the devil in the flesh, we must first look into the abyss that gave birth and raised her. Mabel was not born a monster at the same time. She was forged by them in the fire of family violence and madness. Her father was William Talvas, a man whose name was uttered only with a whisper, fearing to cause trouble in his house. He was not just a powerful Norman feudal from Bell's house. He was a tyrant, who ruled his vast lands with an iron fist, pierced with spikes, and was known for finding perverted pleasure in the sufferings of others. Legends say that he loved to find his enemies and cripple them, blinding them for fun, turning proud warriors into helpless cripples. It is not surprising that in such an atmosphere of absolute moral decay, even the closest people were not safe. William's first wife, Mabel of Hildenberg, was killed at the behest of her own husband. History has preserved terrible details. She went to the church to pray, perhaps asking for salvation from her despotic husband, when William's mercenaries reached her and strangled her right on the road. It was not just a murder. It was a message to everyone who dared to transcribe Talvas's will. Mabel, who was probably born in the fortress of the Belleme castle around 1030, spent her childhood in the shadows of this murder. She grew up absorbing the atmosphere of fear and domination. At that time, the aristocrats were the guardians of the family history, and without a doubt, Mabel learned about how her family accumulated wealth through violence, the capture of lands and the elimination of competitors. But instead of being afraid of the cruelty of her father, she, it seems, began to worship her. The turning point that determined the future fate of Mabel and showed the true essence of her family happened in 1048. This event entered history as one of the most barbaric acts of treachery of that time. It all started with the conflict between the Bells and Giroux families. William of Gerua was a vassal, and, as the other father of Mabel, William of Talvas, was considered. But in the feudal world, friendship was often just a mask of envy. The lands of Gerua were in Maine, and he was also a vassal of another lord, which caused Talvas to commit paranoid jealousy and greed. Talvas wanted to dominate all the lands around his possessions, and the existence of an independent neighbor was an insult to him. The culmination of this enmity occurred during the celebration of Talvas's wedding with his second wife, the daughter of Raoul VI, Viscount de Beaumont. Under the mask of hospitality and celebration, a monstrous plan was hidden. Talvas invited his old friend William Girouin to a feast. The wine was poured by the river, the tables were broken by the wildness, and Girouin, without suspecting anything, enjoyed the feast. At some point, when the vigilance of the guests became dull, Talvas left the hall, allegedly going hunting or doing business, but in fact he gave his people a terrible order. Right in the middle of the wedding party, Talvas's people captured William Giroux. What happened next makes blood boil. It was not an honest duel. It was an execution through a curfew. They blinded William Giroux, tearing his eyes out. But Talvas's rage was not enough. He ordered to cut off his ex-friend's ears and nose, turning his face into a bloody mess. This act of extreme cruelty was carried out publicly, impudently, as a demonstration of the absolute impunity of the Belleme clan. Talvas did not just want to eliminate his opponent. He wanted to destroy his human appearance, humiliate his mouth and show everyone in Normandy what was happening to those who were on the way to Belle. However, this act of barbarism did not remain without consequences. The Jirua clan, shocked and outraged, immediately declared war. They cast their anger on William Talvas' land, and something unexpected happens here. William Talvas, this formidable tyrant who loved to torture the defenseless, suddenly showed cowardice before the face of a real military threat. He hid in his citadel, the castle of Belleme, hoping to wait for a storm. But the storm came from within. His own son, brother Mabel, Arnulf, tired of his father's madness and realizing that the actions of the old man lead the family to death, decided to act. Arnulf raised a revolt against his father. In a dramatic turn of events, Arnulf expelled William Talvas from the castle, depriving him of his power and blood. The great tyrant turned out to be a homeless outlaw. And here, at this critical moment, Mabel de Bellême makes a choice that will determine her entire life and her black legend. Most of the daughters would have remained under the protection of the brother, the new lord. But Mabel was the daughter of her father. She obviously saw in Arnulf a weakling or a traitor. Instead of staying in the safety of the castle, she followed her cruel, immoral, morally expelled father. This decision speaks of Mabel more than any other chronicle. She chose the side of pure, undisguised evil. She and her father found refuge in the family of Montgomery, another powerful clan that ruled vast lands in the center of Normandy. The Montgomery family saw a unique opportunity in this situation. William Talvas, although exiled, still had rights and titles. And Mabel was his beloved daughter and, in fact, the only faithful heir to his spirit. Roger de Montgomery, an ambitious young nobleman, quickly understood the benefit. Mabel was not just a fugitive, she was a key to the lands of the Belles, which bordered Normandy and served as an important buffer against the monarchy of Maine. The alliance was concluded, Mabel married Roger de Montgomery. It was a calculation marriage, saturated with ambitions and a thirst for power, but fate seemed to favor the villain. Soon after that, in about 1049, Arnulf, the brother of Mabel, who had exiled his father, suddenly died. The death of Arnulf is shrouded in mystery, as well as much in the history of this family. Some sources claim that he was killed in his bed, strangled in a dream after stealing a pig from a nun and eating it for dinner, a grotesque detail that can be an allegory of his greed or a real fact. Others whisper that his death was too convenient for Mabel and her new husband. With the death of her brother, Mabel became the only heir to the huge possessions of Belle's house. In one moment from the daughter of the exile, she became one of the richest and most influential women in Normandy. She was about 20 years old when she took up her rights, and she was ready to show the world that she was not just the wife of the Lord, but an independent formidable force. Roger de Montgomery, being the favorite of the young Duke Wilhelm, the future conqueror, used the inheritance of his wife to expand his influence. But Mabel was not going to be a peddler. The hoards of that time, dated around 1060, show that her signature was immediately after the signature of her husband and bishop, her uncle. It was incomprehensible. In the world of men, Mabel de Bellême declared herself as equal, as a ruler with whom one should be considered. She inherited from her father not only the land, but also his temperament. But if William Talvas was just a cruel butcher, Mabel was smarter. She was a politician. She understood that cruelty was a tool, and she was ready to use it with surgical precision. New conflicts were brewing on the horizon, and Mabel de Bellême was just beginning her bloody journey to the top of power. A journey that would be sown by the corpses of enemies, poisoned with cups and destroyed monasteries. Normandy did not yet know what demon she had warmed up on her chest, but very soon the name Mabel will become a synonym for horror. If this first immersion in the dark mind of Mabel de Bellême has already made you anxious, believe me, then she will show something from which the cold will run down her back. And here's what you can do. Instead of simply subscribing to the channel, click on the hype button. Yes, that's right. Raise the degree of how she raised the fear of her enemies. In the next part, we will analyze how she used poison to eliminate opponents with ice calm. And now I'm really interested to know your opinion in the comments. Is Mabel's cruelty her father's legacy or a cold survival strategy in a cruel world? Leave your theory below. By 1055, Mabel de Bellême and Roger de Montgomery were not just a married couple, but a single political body whose pupils covered most of Normandy. They had 10 children, 6 sons and 4 daughters, which in itself was a feat in the era of high child mortality. But Mabel was not a typical mother sitting at the doorstep. She was a co-governor. Unlike many women of her time, whose power was hidden, Mabel acted openly. She ruled her lands with manly determination, and her word was the law. But it was in her relationship with the church that the same dark paradox began to appear, which has been challenging historians to this day. On the one hand, Mabel was a generous mecenat. She restored monasteries, donated huge sums to the construction of temples and gave churchmen expensive gifts. Would seem to be the behavior of a true Christian. But the chronicler Orderic Vitali, a monk who lived at that time, draws a completely different picture. He claims that a deep, irrational hatred of monks was hidden behind the mask of nobility. Mabel, according to him, saw in the priests not servants of God, but parasites, which must be kept in a nest. And she had her own sophisticated way of torturing them, not with a sword, but with abuse of hospitality. In the Middle Ages, monasteries were obliged to provide blood and food to noble travelers. It was a sacred duty. Mabel turned this duty into a weapon. She deliberately came to the Abbey of Sénévrol with a huge banquet. Hundreds of knights, servants, relatives, and children. She was detained there for a long time, demanding the best wine, the best meat and full service. These visits were similar to the invasion of Saranchi. The reserves of the monastery, calculated for a long winter, were destroyed within a few days. The monks were hungry, the treasury was empty, and Mabel was just watching them in despair, enjoying her power over the holy people. The conflict reached an apogee during one of such devastating visits. The abbot, tired of seeing his brothers being poor, gathered his courage and spoke against the countess. He begged her to calm her appetite, reminding her of the wrath of God and that the church could not feed her army endlessly. Mabel's response entered history as an example of her indelible pride. Instead of apologizing, she fell into rage. Her eyes were lit with the same fire that once burned in the eyes of her father, the sadist. She whispered to the abbot in her face, "Since you complain about my visits, next time I will come with an even bigger candle, and I will stay here for twice as long. I will drink your burrows to the bottom and eat everything to the last crumb." The abbot, realizing that the words were powerless before such evil, grudgingly said, "If you do this, you will undoubtedly suffer the consequences. God will not allow you to mock your home like this." And on the same night, as if in response to the curse of the monk, Mabel suddenly fell ill. It was not an ordinary cold. A sharp, unbearable pain pierced her body, forcing the mighty countess to grieve in agony. Scared that it was really a heavenly punishment, she ordered to leave the monastery immediately. Her ran in panic at night, taking away the suffering mistress. And it is here that one of the most terrible and grotesque legends about Mabel de Bellême is born, a story that may be an exaggeration, but ideally illustrates the horror that she instilled in people. The legend says that on the way home, feeling the pain and feeling that the internal poison was burning her alive, Mabel saw a house of a simple peasant on the way. In the madness of suffering, she broke in and saw a man with a baby in his arms. In the attack of some demonic intervention, or perhaps following an ancient dark superstition, she grabbed the child. They say she put her lips on the baby's chest. Believing that he would be able to transmit his pain and illness to an innocent creature, suck out his health and spit out his poison. According to this gloomy story, the baby died instantly, blackening in the eyes of the insane father, and Mabel, having felt relief, simply threw away the lifeless body and continued her way. Is this true? Most likely, this is a myth born of fear. Perhaps she was feeding her own child, who died on the road, and the popular gossip distorted the facts, turning the tragedy into an act of vampirism. But it is important that people believed in it. They believed that Mabel was able to kill a child with one touch to save her skin. This story strengthened the reputation of the witch, a woman who made a deal with darkness and for whom there is nothing sacred. But if she waged war against the monks, she was prepared to use much more deadly methods with her political enemies. The poison that, as they said, flowed in her veins, soon had to be in the cups of her opponents. If the story with the baby was the origin of the national fears, then the following events are documented much more reliably and reveal Mabel as a cold-blooded political killer. The year 1063 stood in the yard. The old enemies of the Belleme house, the Giroux family, whom Mabel's father humiliated so cruelly, raised their heads again. Arnold the chauffeur, the son of that very William of Giroux, who was blinded and defiled at the wedding, managed to obtain forgiveness from the Duke of Wilhelm the Conqueror. It was incredible. Wilhelm, the future King of England, was famous for his toughness, but this time he showed mercy, agreeing to return confiscated lands to Arnold. For Mabel, it was not just a political defeat, it was a personal insult. The return of Giroux meant that the enemies of her father would again be at the power, right at her borders. She could not allow it. If Duke Wilhelm was too weak or blind to destroy the threat, she would do it herself. But this time not with a sword and not with an army. A woman in the world of men must act more subtly. Mabel developed a plan worthy of the best tragedies of Shakespeare. She decided that Arnold must die before he will have time to enjoy his return. She knew that her husband, Roger, was to meet with Arnold for negotiations or reconciliation. Mabel used the influence of the hostess of the house to prepare a special treat. She personally took care that a deadly poison was added to the wine cup intended for Arnold. It was the perfect plan. Murder under the mask of hospitality, a crime without witnesses. On the appointed day, Arnold arrived at the castle. The cup was on the table, waiting for his victim. But fate, as if laughing at Mabel's plans, made its own adjustments. Arnold, perhaps warned by one of his servants or simply driven by intuition, refused to drink wine. He was careful, knowing who he was dealing with. However, the poison could not simply evaporate. Gilbert, the brother of Mabel's husband, entered the castle, heated after a long ride. He was tired, his thirst tormented him. Seeing a cup of cold wine on the table, he grabbed it without asking for permission and dried it with a stick. Mabel probably froze in horror, but it was already late. The poison took effect instantly. Gilbert, the faithful brother of her husband, a man from her own family, fell to the floor, shivering in shivers. Death came quickly and tormentingly. It was a catastrophe. Mabel killed not an enemy, but a relative. Any other woman in her place would have been broken from a sense of guilt or fear of disclosure. But Mabel de Bellême was made of another test. For her, Gilbert's death was only an annoying mistake, loss of resources, accompanying damage. She did not shed a tear. Her goal, Arnold, was still alive, and that was the only thing that mattered. The fact that she accidentally killed de Vere did not stop her, but only made her even more decisive. She realized that direct methods are too risky. She needed someone Arnold trusted unconditionally. Not losing time while innocent killed Gilbert was crying in the castle, Mabel began a new operation. She found an approach to Merger Arnold, a man who was responsible for food and drinks of his master. We do not know for sure what she used: gold, threats or promises of power, but Merger was bought. The betrayal took place. Soon after that Arnold the chauffeur, being safe in his own home surrounded by faithful people, drank the wine given to him by his personal servant. This time there was no cut. Yet Mabel finally found his goal. Arnold died, and with him the hopes of the Yeroon clan for the Renaissance collapsed. The headless family crumbled, unable to withstand the iron grip of Mabel. These two events, the accidental murder of Dever and the successful poisoning of the opponent, showed to the whole of Normandy that Mabel de Bellême was invulnerable. Even when her plans were falling apart and innocent people were dying, she was coming out of the water dry. Her husband, Roger, either did not know the truth, or, more likely, was an accomplice, preferring to close his eyes to the methods of his wife, while they brought new lands and power to their family. Mabel proved that a woman can be more dangerous than the army. But every crime has its price. Eliminating enemies one by one, she did not notice how a ring of hatred clashed around her, which one day would not be able to stop neither poison, nor gold, nor the high walls of the castle. Gilbert and Arnold's blood was dripping with revenge. And although Mabel felt like a goddess of death, she remained mortal, with her becoming less and less friends and more of those who wanted to see her head separated from her body. By the end of the 70s of the 11th century, the name Mabel de Bellême became synonymous with absolute overwhelming power. But here comes a question that puts many researchers at a dead end. Would they judge her as strictly, even if she were a man? At that cruel time, lords often behaved like beasts. Wilhelm the Conqueror himself could have been a merciless butcher when circumstances required it. The difference was that men expected it. Sword, blood and domination were the language of masculinity. But Mabel was a woman. Society expected her to be a mother, to pray and raise children, and instead she received a matriarch who would take over the land, poison her rivals and rule the whole region, pushing her husband to the second level. Her ambitions did not know the limits, and it was this insufficiency that led her to a fatal conflict, which started a countdown to her life. In 1077, her vision fell on the possession of Hugh Bonnel. It was a respected knight, whose family owned lands for generations. For Mabel, he was just an obstacle, another figure on the chessboard, which had to be thrown away. Using her influence, legal tricks and, of course, the rude strength of her clan, she did what she could best. She deprived Hugh of everything. It was not just a military seizure, it was the destruction of dignity. She confiscated his heirs' lands, his castles, his income. Hugh Bonnel, a proud nobleman, at the same time turned into a beggar. His family was ruined, thrown out into the street like garbage. Mabel probably didn't even think about the consequences. For her, Hugh was already politically dead, which meant he had no threat. She got used to her enemies either dying of poison or running in fear. But Hugh Bonnel was not broken. He was cornered, and as you know, there is no beast more dangerous than the one who has nothing to lose. Instead of reconciling and disappearing into oblivion, Hughes hid an icy rage. He did not seek justice from the Duke, for he knew that the courts were bought, and Wilhelm the Conqueror favored the Montgomery family. He realized that there was only one court that could punish the wolf from Alençon, the Sword Court. For 2 long years, he lived with one thought, revenge. He watched, he waited, he planned. While Mabel enjoyed her wealth in the stolen castles, Hugh gathered around him his brothers, who were also devoid of blood and thirsty. Mabel, blinded by her might, made a classic mistake of a tyrant. She underestimated the little man. She thought that the fear she instilled was her best defense. She believed that no one would dare raise their hand on the wife of Roger de Montgomery and her father's lover. But she forgot that fear can turn into hatred of such a power that it will sweep away any obstacles. By the winter of 1079, the clouds over her head thickened. Hugh Bonnel and 3 of his brothers were ready. They knew its schedule, its habits, and the location of its chambers. They were not going to fight, they were going to be executed. December 10, 1079. The cold wind from La Manche penetrated Normandy to the bones, but it was warm in the castle of Burs-sur-d'Ivy. Mabel de Bellême felt completely safe. Her husband, Roger, was on the way, but the castle was full of servants and guards. She had just taken a bath, a luxury available only to the highest nobility, and was relaxing in her bed, perhaps thinking about new plans to capture the lands or humiliate another abbot. Her body was relaxed, her vigilance was filled with comfort and wine. At the same time, shadows were moving in the darkness behind the walls of the castle. Hugh Bonnel and his brothers managed to get inside. The story is silent about how exactly they did it. Did they bribe the guards, find a secret passage, or just use the negligence of the guards, who did not believe that someone would dare to attack Mabel herself? But the fact remains a fact. The Avengers were inside the citadel. With the swords in their hands, holding their breath, they crawled through the corridors, heading straight to the Countess's room. The door to the bedroom opened. Mabel, probably, barely managed to lift her head off the pillow. She saw in front of her not servants, but the faces of people whose lives she had destroyed. In the eyes of Hugh Bonnell, she read her sentence. There were no long speeches, no pompous villainous laughter. It was a massacre. Hugh and his brothers threw themselves at her with primordial rage. One swing of the sword and the head of the wolf from Alissa, the woman who held half of Normandy in fear, rolled down the floor. It was cruel, fast and final. The blood poured over the dear cemeteries and carpets. The most powerful and hated woman of her time was killed in her own bed, defenseless and naked, just as she left her enemies naked and defenseless. But killing was only half of the job. Now the brothers had to survive. The castle woke up from the screams. Realizing what they had done, the killers ran away. They jumped out into the cold night, jumped on the horses and ran away. To cut off the chase, they showed tactical cunning. Having crossed the river Div, they destroyed the bridge behind them. When the guard Mabel finally remembered and threw herself into the chase, they ran into the icy water. Hugh Bonnell and his brothers dissolved in the darkness, leaving behind the headless body of a tyrant and a legend that will live forever. This night changed the history of Normandy, but revenge is a dish that is served cold. If you have goosebumps from this scene, subscribe to the channel right now, so as not to miss the ending. And write in the comments the word justice, if you think that Hugh Bonnell did the right thing, or cruelty, if you think that no one deserves such a death. Let's blow up the comments. The silence that descended on the Bursar Div after that fatal night of December 1079 was heavier than the screams that were heard here just a few hours ago. When the winter sun sluggishly rose over the horizon of Normandy, it illuminated a scene that shocked all the feudal society of Europe. Mabel de Bellême. The woman, who seemed immortal in her anger, lay in the puddle of her own blood, headless, humiliated and, finally, defeated. The servants, who discovered the body, froze in horror not so much from the sight of death, but from the realization that the world, which they knew, had collapsed. The wolf was dead, and the vacuum of power, which she left behind, threatened to drag everyone into chaos. News of her death spread with the speed of a plague. Hunters drove horses to death to deliver a message to Rouen and London. For Wilhelm the Conqueror, it was a blow to the breath. Mabel was a monster, yes, but she was his monster. She held the southern borders of Normandy in fear, she was a shield against Anjou and men. Her cruelty was a political tool used by the crown. The king came into indescribable rage. He perceived the murder of Mabel not as an act of justice by the offended knight, but as a personal insult to his royal power. He swore that Hugh Bonnell and his brothers would envy the dead when he reached them. One of the largest hunts on people in the history of medieval Normandy began. Wilhelm sent his best cavalry to comb forests, roads and ports, but Hugh Bonnell, who committed a murderous act of revenge, showed the miracles of a tactical genius. Having destroyed the bridge over the Dive River, he won precious watches that separated life from death. While the people of the king looked at the icy waters of the river, cursing the fugitives, the brothers were already far away. They understood that they no longer had a place in Normandy and France. All of northern Europe became a trap for them. Their path was a separate odyssey. They ran to the south, through the Alps, to the land where the power of Wilhelm was only a rumor. They reached Apulia in southern Italy, where the Norman mercenaries created their own kingdoms. There, under the hot sun of the Mediterranean, the Mabel killers found not only a shelter, but also a new life. Historical chronicles, full of irony, tell us that Hugh Bonnell, the man who cut off the woman's head in her bed, lived a long life. Later, he probably went to Byzantium to fight the Turks under the banners of Emperor Alexei Comnene. He died a deep old man, a respected warrior, never regretting that winter night. It was a spit in the face of Domubal. Their main enemy not only survived, but also flourished. Meanwhile, in Normandy, a surreal scene of funerals took place. The body of Mabel, somehow put in order, was delivered to the Abbey of Troarn. The irony was so thick that it could be cut with a knife. Mabel hated the monks. She robbed them, mourned hunger, despised their prayers. And now it was these people, whom she considered parasites, who had to sing psalms to appease her soul. The chronicles do not tell us what the monks thought, putting her coffin in the cold ground, but it can be assumed that their prayers were mixed with a secret gratitude. She praised her genius, her nobleness, and her merits before the fatherland. But the people's memory wrote its own epitaph, much shorter and more cruel. Here lies the one whose death brought more joy than her life. However, if someone thought that Mabel's nightmare had ended with death, they were wrong. The evil that she sowed did not disappear, it simply replaced the bearer. Her eldest son, Robert de Bellême, stood by her mother's grave not with tears in his eyes, but with a cold account. He inherited all the lands of his mother and father, becoming one of the most powerful magnates of the Anglo-Norman world. And very soon it became clear that the apple fell not far from the apple tree, but directly into the hellish flame. If Mabel was cruel for political gain, then Robert seemed to be a sadist by calling. Contemporaries described him as a man without a soul. He did not just kill enemies, he invented torture. It is said that Robert de Bellême surpassed his mother in art to cause pain. He refused to take a ransom for the captives, a practice that was the basis of the nightly war and the economy of that time. Instead of gold, he preferred to see how they rot in his dungeons. He enjoyed the sight of exhausted, dying from hunger people. One of his favorite punishments was to plant people on sharp stilts, a slow and painful death that could last for days. Unlike Mabel, who used cruelty as a shield in the male world, Robert used it as a sword, without distinguishing right and wrong. Years later, when Wilhelm the Conqueror died and his sons began to gnaw on his inheritance, Robert de Bellême became the central figure of chaos. He built castles without the king's permission, he burned down villages, he terrorized entire regions. His power became so toxic that even the new King of England, Henry I, the son of the Conqueror, understood while Rod Bellême is alive, there will be no peace. It took a whole royal campaign, siege after siege, to break the spine of this monster. In 1112, Robert was finally captured, but he was not executed. Henry I, probably considering death too easy, threw him into the dungeon of the castle of Wareham. There, in complete darkness, Robert de Bellême spent the rest of his days. No one knows when exactly he died. He simply disappeared from history, erased by oblivion, as his mother wanted for her enemies. The dynasty, built on the blood of William Talva's and Mabel's ambitions, crumbled to dust just one generation after her death. Their castles turned into ruins, their wealth was confiscated, and their names became scarecrows for children. The story of Mabel de Bellême leaves us with serious questions. Who was she really? Orderic Vitali, a monk who wrote most of what we know about her, clearly hated her. Was he objective? Perhaps he exaggerated her sins, demonized her simply because she was a woman who dared to take power in her hands. After all, men of that era did things that were no less terrible, but they were called great conquerors, and she was a witch. But even if we discard the pretense of the monks, the facts remain facts. Poisoned cups, selected lands, destroyed lives. Mabel de Bellême was the product of cruel, merciless time. She understood the rules of the game and decided to play harder than anyone else. She refused to be a victim, but in her desire to become a predator, she lost her human appearance. Her life is a tragedy of Shakespearean scale, played on the dirty roads of Normandy. This is a reminder that power, devoid of compassion, always devours its owner. She thought that she was building a dynasty for centuries, but built only a crypt. Today, when tourists wander the ruins of the Norman fortresses, the wind, whistling in the empty crevices of the manors, seems to still whisper her name. The name of a woman who wanted to be a queen, but became a legend of horror. We have come to the end of this bloody saga. The story of Mabel de Bellême is over, but the story of human cruelty and ambitions is endless. If this story made your heart beat faster, if you felt the cold of the medieval night, subscribe to the channel. There are even more dark secrets ahead of us, even more forgotten names. Leave a comment below. Did Mabel deserve her fate, or was she just a reflection of her cruel world? And most importantly, do you justify Hugh Bonnell? I read every comment. See you in the next video, where we will open the door to the past again, which would be better to forget.